Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the operational case study of November 2019. Here we're going to be looking at the real-world chocolate confectionery industry and indeed focusing in on the premium end of that industry based on the company that we're dealing with in the pre-scene. Before we begin, let me just give you a quick rundown of what exactly the purpose of an industry analysis is. After all, a lot of students ask, why are we doing an industry analysis when we're already given industry information in the pre-scene document itself? Isn't this overkill? Well, one thing that I should say at the outset is that you're certainly not expected to be any kind of industry expert. Of course, you're not expected to know everything about the industry, all of the ins and outs, any more than you would be if you were working in the company itself. You're not expected to understand every aspect of the wider industry. However, understanding the wider business environment and industrial context in a general way does have two key potential benefits on exam day. Firstly, it helps you to anticipate some of the potential issues that might arise in the unseen scenario and therefore avoid surprises and or confusion on the day of the exam itself. So if you think about it, of course, an organization is going to have to respond to both internal and external threats, developments and changes, and so understanding what is going on in the wider industry context can help you to anticipate some of the issues that might arise on exam day as the organization has to respond to external changes and evolution. It also makes it easier to illustrate and apply some of your abstract theoretical knowledge by using concrete examples and specifics. So in this industry analysis then, we'll be presenting you with some information and details specific to this industry that will help you to then put your applied theory into context within this specific industry. So for those two reasons, I think it is important to get a better sense of the wider industry and to go a little bit deeper, a little bit beyond just what you're given in the pre-scene document itself. So let me just give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the industry analysis today. First of all, we're going to start with a very general survey of the chocolate confectionery market overall. We're going to be looking at some key quantitative trends and developments and indeed some projections for the coming years. From there, then, we're going to move into some of the more specific details. We're looking in particular at the manufacturing process, all of the supply chain involved and how the chocolate and the cocoa gets from the plantation to your mouth. Then in section 3, we're going to be looking at luxury and the premium end in particular of the chocolate industry, because of course the company that we're dealing with in the pre-scene is primarily focused on that luxury and premium end of the market, and we're going to look at some interesting facts and trends within that segment. From there then in section 4, we're going to take a closer look at the major players within the industry, in particular within the luxury end of the industry, and we're going to focus in on one company in particular, which I think is a good template for the pre-scene company that we're dealing with, and also I think offers some potential inspiration for the company in the pre-scene in terms of their future trajectory, some ideas that they could put into practice themselves. At the end of this industry PowerPoint, we have also included many of the sources that we have relied on in forming this industry analysis. So if you want to take a closer look at any of the details mentioned or do a deep dive on any aspects in particular in your own time, you are of course free to do so. So let's start with a general market overview of the chocolate confectionery industry. Chocolate is, of course, the most well-known and indeed consumed and very profitable component of the confectionery industry across the world. Based on the quantities of cocoa, different ranges of chocolates are produced worldwide. The increasingly refined preferences of consumers is an imperative factor that can, in principle, aid companies in product development and marketing tactics to establish a wider consumer base and capture new markets. So often people think that when consumers become pickier, become more choosy, that this might be a challenge, it might be a negative thing overall. But in fact, what we're seeing in recent years is that this increased consumer refinement and preference range is actually expanding their tastes, and it's creating more of a demand for chocolate products. These consumer trends are indeed driving the growth of the real world market for chocolate overall. So we're going to be focusing in on this increased refinement of consumer preferences and demand a little bit later on. But it's worth mentioning at the outset that this really is a core dynamic within this industry. So let's take a look at some of the geographical facts here pertaining to the consumption of chocolate and the major consumers of chocolate per capita. Perhaps unsurprisingly, if you know anything about chocolate, Switzerland is right up there near the top, both in terms of consumption and production. Switzerland, of course, is world renowned for chocolate. Swiss have a long love affair with chocolate. It was Francois Louis Cailler who opened the first mechanized chocolate factory in Corsier-sur-Vevey. I'm sure I'm absolutely mangling the pronunciation there, but anyway, in 1819. And it was Daniel Peter in 1875 who made the first milk chocolate with help from his neighbour Henri Nestlé. Of course, I'm sure you'll recognise that surname. The two would later go on to form the Nestlé Company in 1879. So it's Nestlé that we have to thank for the existence of milk chocolate. You can see here on the right, this is the ranking of consumption per capita in chocolate by country. Switzerland at the top, Germany in second place, Ireland and the UK tied in third place, and then you have two Scandinavians, Norway and Sweden, followed by Australia, Netherlands, and perhaps surprisingly for some of you, the US is actually quite far down on that list in terms of consumption per capita. The United States, of course, is often associated with being very much high in the ranking when it comes to the consumption of these kinds of confectionery goods and so on, but it is actually quite low down there, as you can see. So now we're looking at exporters and importers of chocolate, the major exporters and importers. As you can see here on the right, the top exporters of chocolate consumer goods are Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, the Netherlands, and the United States. So that's exporters of chocolate consumer goods, not to be confused with the exporting of cocoa from plantations, for example. As we'll see a little bit later on, there are different countries that are the leaders in terms of exporting the raw materials that go into consumer chocolate products. The top importers then are the United States in absolute terms, not surprising, although per capita, as we saw, the consumption rates are actually lower there. Germany then in second place, France, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. So again, remember those are absolute numbers, whereas in the previous slide we were looking at per capita consumption. You can see here, this is a nice little visual overview, a graphic of the biggest chocolate producers. Germany in first place, Italy second place, France, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and then Belgium, also very famously associated with chocolate. These are the EU's biggest chocolate producers. We were looking at the global rankings in the previous slide, so focusing in a little bit on Europe here, because of course we are told that the company in the pre-scene is based in Europe. So that's what they're up against in terms of their neighbours and the production of chocolate, and that this was from the year 2017. Looking then at the global chocolate market, we're looking at quite a healthy compound annual growth rate projected through from 2018 to 2024. If you compare that with the projected compound annual growth rate for world GDP, that's coming in at around 3%. So you compare the 7% with 3%, that is a fairly healthy compound annual growth rate in the chocolate market overall, it has to be said. So things looking pretty good for chocolate in general. So now let's look at the manufacturing process in a little bit more detail. Some of this was mentioned, of course, in the pre-scene document, but it's worth reviewing it and going over it one more time. So we're going to start by looking at the phase that comes before the actual manufacturing process for chocolate products. Here we're looking at the harvesting of the cocoa beans themselves. So in your pre-scene document, there was a good deal of detail given on the actual manufacturing process itself and all the different steps involved there. But there wasn't really much said about the process before that, when we're talking about, for example, the suppliers of cocoa beans, how they actually get the cocoa beans and what they do before they're actually shipped and delivered to the chocolate manufacturers themselves. So this is a good little visual overview of what happens. You have, first of all, the pods growing on what are called cacao trees. So the cocoa is actually coming from the cacao fruit, which you can see visually represented here on the left on this cacao tree. These are then harvested, the cacao fruit is cut open, and the beans inside are then extracted. So the cocoa beans are extracted from the cacao fruit, and the beans are then fermented, as you can see here in number 3 or part 3 of this process, fermenting of the beans. And the purpose of fermentation is to kill the germ and destroy the seed coat. So the germ basically is that part of the seed which would grow into or sprout into a new cacao tree plant. So they need to kill that germ because, of course, you don't want your chocolate to start sprouting. It takes about 6 to 10 days for the fermenting process to be completed, at which point the beans are then dried. And the drying process also takes around 5 to 10 days. Sun drying is a very common practice and a very efficient way of drying the cocoa beans, and unsurprisingly for that reason, the major regions are in the tropical and warm climates of places like Latin America and West Africa, especially, as we'll see. The next steps then are usually taking place in the manufacturing plant of the chocolate producer itself. So after the drying and fermenting has been completed on the plantation, they are then shipped to the manufacturers of chocolate, just like the company that we're dealing with in the pre-scene. So the first step at this point then is to roast the cocoa beans to enhance the flavour. Then you have the cracking and winnowing process to take the shells off the bean. Then you have grinding, and the grinding is usually combined with sugar for sweetness and enhancement of flavour again. And then finally you will have tempering and moulding. I won't go into too much detail on these points because these are already quite well covered in the pre-scene. Some interesting facts now about cocoa beans, just to give you a little bit of background and depth. Cocoa beans are actually the dried and fully fermented seeds of the Theobroma cacao tree, as we saw earlier. Cocoa solids and cocoa butter are then extracted from these seeds. The cacao tree is indigenous to the Americas, so that was the original location of cocoa, having originated in Central America and some parts of Mexico. However, currently about 70% of the world's cocoa is produced by, as I mentioned, West African nations. The Observatory of Economic Complexity, or the OEC, ranks cocoa beans as the 443rd most traded commodity in the world. And in the year 2016, the net worth of cocoa beans export market was approximately 4.74 billion. So let's look at some of these major exporters of cocoa beans. We've already looked at some of the exporters of the chocolate consumer products and importers. Now we're focusing on the raw materials. And you can see here, unsurprisingly, West African nations are way out in front. Perfect climate for the production of cacao trees and cocoa beans, I should say. The top exporters, the Ivory Coast, is way out ahead of everyone else. You can see there 51.7% of the global export of cocoa is from the Ivory Coast, followed then by its neighbour Ghana, followed in third place by Nigeria, and then you have a couple of South American countries in Ecuador. One South American country in Ecuador and then another African country in Cameroon. So Africa is really dominating. West Africa in particular is dominating this export market, with one South American nation coming in the top 5, and that is Ecuador. So let's home in a little bit on the top exporter, and that is, of course, the Ivory Coast. Supplies 30% and upwards of the world's total cocoa, leading the rest of the world by over 500,000 metric tons, with a total crop of 1.4 million tonnes. Companies like Nestle and Cadbury receive much of their cocoa from the Ivory Coast, and cocoa alone is responsible for almost 2/3 of the trade revenue coming into the nation. So you could say, I suppose, that the Ivory Coast is perhaps overly reliant on this particular good, but it is certainly way out in front of its neighbours and nearest rivals, so a relatively secure position it does seem. Recently, serious concerns, however, have been raised about the cocoa production in the Ivory Coast. Child labourers, some of whom are subject to 100-hour-long work weeks and physical abuse, have been discovered on many of the farms responsible for the nation's gargantuan output. In addition to the harsh working conditions, child labourers on the Ivory Coast often do not receive any education whatsoever. So think carefully about that, especially when it comes to the manufacturers, chocolate manufacturers in developed countries. You can imagine that they will be very, very sensitive to these kinds of stories coming out, especially when they talk a good talk on the ethics front. So ethics is always a very important consideration with CIMA, and I would not be surprised to see something like this coming up on exam day, some kind of issue pertaining to the ethical credentials of some of the suppliers of cocoa from, for example, some of these African nations when it comes to child labour and so on. Import then of cocoa beans. You can see these are the major importers. So this will be importing the raw cocoa beans before the actual manufacturing of chocolate consumer products. So this would correspond roughly then to the exporters of consumer chocolate that were mentioned earlier. The top importers in absolute terms are the Netherlands, the United States in second, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and then Malaysia coming in fifth place. Let's look at some of the main trends in Europe now. Europe is anticipated to hold a substantial share of the global chocolate market in the coming years. Germany had 1/4 of the Western European market in terms of consumption and sales of chocolate in the year 2016. The increasing acceptance of dairy-free, healthy and organic recipes, this was mentioned in the pre-scene, for desserts, and the presence of numerous key market players such as Ferrero Group, Nestlé, Chokolate Fabriken, Lindt and Sprüngli, or Lindt and Sprüngli for short, and Pladis in this region will be key factors in driving the global chocolate market during the forecast period. Lindt indeed is one of the major players in the luxury segment of the chocolate industry, and it's one of the few luxury chocolate manufacturers that really has a global reach and presence in the contemporary market. So one to watch out for there when it comes to the company that we're dealing with in the pre-scene, for example. One of their major rivals is likely to be a company along the lines of Lindt. So let's look at some trends then in the United States. Chocolate and confectionery consumption in the USA is expected to continue its upward trend, supported by population growth and rising purchasing power, along with an increasing demand for premium chocolate and confectionery items. Furthermore, greater interest in healthy lifestyles continues to drive consumption of sugar-free, organic and dark chocolate. And we'll see a little later on, those trends are being replicated all over the world. So what can we expect? Well, the Americas and Europe are expected to register significant growth on account of the strong presence of prominent chocolate manufacturers such as Hershey's and Ferrero. Most companies in the global market have undertaken several business expansion strategies such as mergers and acquisitions to gain a competitive advantage. So if we're seeing an increasing growth in this market, it's likely that we'll also see consolidation as we try to take advantage of economies of scale, particularly in the luxury and premium segment of the market. As demand goes up for that end of the market, we're likely to see more mergers and acquisitions activity occurring. There's also been investment in research and development activities to introduce innovative chocolates and associated products, and this reflects people's increasing demand and refinement of preferences for unusual or distinct or unique flavors. So for instance, Lee's introduced a new range of meringue shells with dark Belgian chocolate. ITC Limited recently launched ruby chocolates through their luxury brand Fabel in India. So this is happening all over the world. This is not just happening in developed markets, I should say, but also in developing and emerging markets where the refined preferences are manifesting there as well. So let's look at the luxury end of the market a little bit more detail, some of the key facts and trends from this segment. So whether something is actually a luxury chocolate or not depends on many variables, such as, for example, where it is sold, how it's actually presented in the place where it's being sold, the kind of visuals that are associated with it, and indeed the degree of customer service. Many of the luxury chocolate manufacturers, of course, have their own branded stores, and so they can very carefully manage and curate the kind of experience that the customer has when they purchase the chocolates. Of course, the price point point is going to determine in many people's minds whether or not something counts as being luxury. The listed ingredients are always going to be a consideration as well. Country of origin increasingly is becoming something that people look at when it comes to foodstuffs, and chocolate is no different. The cocoa bean variety, this is a little bit more refined in terms of people's expertise. Most people probably wouldn't be able to distinguish between cocoa bean varieties, but in general consumer trends, especially in developed nations, people are becoming more discriminating across the board when it comes to what's going into their food. When you see things like, for example, craft beers and other similar products, people are becoming more and more demanding and more discerning about what exactly is inside the consumption goods that they're purchasing, and the chocolate industry may well be going that way as well. We might soon see people searching out chocolate in the same way as they search out a particular craft beer with a particular flavour profile and so on and so forth. Also, of course, the manufacturer's reputation is going to come into that as well. And finally, whether they actually make the chocolate themselves directly from the cocoa bean or whether they buy it in pre-made bulk couverture and reform it into chocolates. So obviously the mass market, non-premium, non-luxury end, they're going to buy it in pre-made bulk, but at the luxury and premium end, they are expected to create the whole thing from scratch, from the cocoa bean, in-house themselves. And of course the company, the Pre-Seen, is no different in that respect. Chocolate Box manufactures all of the chocolate in their own factory, or at least 95% is coming from within their own factory, as we're told in the Pre-Seen. So virtually all of it is completely controlled internally and is not outsourced to others, whereas the mass market is still dominated by this kind of pre-made bulk buying. So those are all really important factors that have to be taken into account when it comes to determining whether or not something is counting as a luxury chocolate. It's not that all of these are necessary. It might not be that all of these are included in a luxury chocolate, but most of them are going to have to be right in order for something to be considered luxury. You could have all of these, for example, but the price might be at a bargain rate, and that could seriously undermine the perception of luxury, even if the quality is actually quite high. So it's very important to get the right formula and the right combination and to strike the right balance between all of those variables that go into whether or not something counts as a luxury chocolate. Consumer opinions, of course, are very important, and of course they'll determine to a large extent whether or not something can actually qualify as a luxury chocolate. So here is the results from a survey among buyers of luxury chocolate products, and they were asked, in your view, which of the following terms or words best describe luxury boxed chocolate? Unsurprisingly, perhaps, quality was right at the top, with great taste coming in second place. Quality is more important than quantity was mentioned as well. For very special occasions, interestingly, and for gifting, those two often go hand in hand, so those are significant considerations as well. Handmade then came in underneath and expensive. And finally, the last three, mixture of flavours in the box, given to impress someone and for my family. So the major associations are still quality. As you can see, quality and great taste, those two things really do go hand in hand. But interestingly then as well, gifting and special occasions as well. So as you saw in the Pre-Seen, gift boxes and gift wrapping, there's a great deal of emphasis on that within Chokolate Box. So that is unsurprisingly when people have the perception or the association of luxury chocolates with gifts and special occasions. So wrapping and presentation are really, really crucial when it comes to choosing one luxury box over another. If you see 2 to 3 different brands of luxury chocolates, the first thing you're going to see, of course, is the packet itself, and the packaging could really be the decisive factor in whether or not someone picks your luxury chocolates or another company's luxury chocolates.